Okay, so thanks for coming back. I'm going to do a quick talk just to wrap this day up about a kind of new initiative we've been working on at BITSS that ties into a lot of what you've talked about and learned about over the past couple of days. And there's just one quick heads up before I move forward, is that we have submitted a manuscript to a journal that is based off of a lot of what I'll present. So it's great that people have been tweeting stuff out, but the last few slides were we'd like to keep under wraps at least for a little bit. If there's a chance it won't get published at this journal, and we'll share the paper on a preprint service or a blog or some other journal if that is the case. But until we hear back from the journal, we'd like to keep this under wraps. So starting at slide 8 is where we'd like to not share stuff, and I can indicate where that is if people are interested in taking screenshots or anything like that. That's the other reason I haven't put this on the OSF. And if people want access to these slides, we can send it. We can send a file through email, or we can try to post a private link on OSF, so it won't be widely accessible to everyone else. But just a quick heads up, and yeah, I'll get started. So like I said, this kind of builds on a lot of what we talked about on days 1 and 2 around publication bias and incomplete reporting, the file drawer problem. But we've come up with an acronym for this proposal that we've developed over the past few months called Report All Results Efficiently. It's a cheesy acronym for RARE. And I'm going to tell you what that is. Before I get into that, I've introduced myself to most of you already, but just as a refresher, I'm the program manager here at BITSS. I love working on our trainings like RT2, and we have some new initiatives around equity, inclusion in academia, which are also really exciting. My background is actually in environmental and agricultural sciences and policy, so a little bit different from what we tend to focus on here, but that's where I come from. Okay, so quickly for the roadmap, the proposal that I'll present it actually kind of fits everything, but the 4 kind of main problems or practices that it kind of targets are pre-registration, thinking about conducting and reporting research in an ethical manner, trying to address publication bias, and transparent reporting and disclosure. Okay, so many of you have probably heard of clinicaltrials.gov. This was one of the very first research registries, if not the first. And it is, so far as we know, the only registry that researchers are legally bound to register their experiments in if they are a applicable clinical trial. So you can think of pharmaceutical trials, vaccines, anything like that. Many of you probably already know this, but just as a kind of like a refresher. And we've kind of been thinking of clinicaltrials.gov as like a model for the social sciences. The problem with that kind of thinking, though, is that there actually is lower compliance than you might expect. So the screenshot I have here on the left is from alltrials.net. It's a campaign to track the actual compliance of registration and reporting of results of clinical trials that are registered. So this is since the registry actually began, and as you can see, I think I took the screenshot yesterday, so it's pretty up to date. At least 70%, only 70% or so have actually reported. And reporting doesn't necessarily mean they reported all of the results completely. It just means that they have reported results, or if they've reported the end of a trial. The FDA has the legal authority to collect fines of up to $12,000 a day for non-compliance, and they've actually collected 0. I think there are a lot of reasons for this. As most people know, at least especially in the current kind of climate with the pandemic and budgetary constraints, collecting fines from universities and other institutions who are usually the ones that are on the hook for this kind of thing might not be a practical or politically expedient thing to do. But this is just kind of to show you that there is kind of an enforcement mechanism that hasn't really been used. So I also cited a paper here on the right. There was a research paper recently that found that 59% of the trials that were registered between March 2018 and September 2019 had not reported results on time. So there are a few different projects out there that are trying to kind of track compliance and across the board kind of finding lower than you would hope. Okay, and we've talked a lot about publication bias. I think we haven't gotten as much into like what the actual harms might be. So this is from an older paper, but it's still fairly relevant. So Turner et al. Looked at the clinical trials registered for antidepressants. And the panel on the right is showing the number of registered trials that reported positive results, found positive results, not reported, versus questionable and negative. And the dark blue, which is the parts of the bars that are on the right, were ones that were not published. So as you can see, trials with questionable or negative results had a much lower likelihood of actually being published. And this actually correlated with the FDA's decision to move forward with approving those antidepressants. So it's kind of a scary thought. This is 12 years old, so things may have changed. But if you look at if you can remember the slide that I showed before, it doesn't present a super optimistic view of how this may have changed in the past decade or so. Okay, and you've all seen these figures again. I'm just gonna just to kind of bring it back to the social sciences. So we don't necessarily have the same kind of enforcement mechanisms as clinical trials and the biomedical sciences do in the social sciences. We have several registries that Ted identified yesterday, but how much they're being used is often an open question. And there are very few kind of incentives for using them aside from making your own research more transparent. So there aren't like the kind of legally binding incentives that there might be for clinical trials. I won't explain these figures too much because you've seen them, but it's just to kind of show you that the reporting of null results in the social sciences is pretty similar to what it is in the biomedical sciences, and that depending on the body of literature you're looking at, you can generally find these kind of humped curves, as you can see on the right, that indicate that publication bias is happening. So it's probably fairly safe to assume that there is a similar phenomenon happening in the social sciences. Okay, so this is the last slide that is shareable. We started trying to think about what we could do to address these problems of publication bias, the file drawer problem, and the related kind of questionable research practices that researchers might use to get published and respond to the incentives that are there for them. So we organized a workshop last year, and it was kind of like a brainstorming workshop where we invited people from all across the social science disciplines who represented both researchers, but also journal editors, funders, compliance officers, and people who were organizing for more complete reporting. So actually this is the reason I chose this picture to include here is because it's kind of representative of that big spectrum. So the woman on the left is a researcher at the World Bank. The man in the middle is a compliance officer at Stanford. He's basically the one person at Stanford that you can go to help you fill out your reporting template for clinical trials. So for the entire university, they've got one guy. I think he might have an assistant. But that's kind of, it's pretty indicative of the amount of support that there generally is for this kind of work. And the man on the right is the editor of the Journal of Development Economics. So we got them all together, and our goal was to try to start brainstorming what a system could look like that would effectively improve more complete reporting in the social sciences, be incentive compatible and also relatively low cost. So it kind of sounds like a pretty lofty goal, which I think it is. But our hope was that if we got all of these people in the room together and we just kind of started spitballing, we'd come up with something that we could build off of. Okay, so the next slide, this is where we'd prefer to not share this, at least for now. But this is kind of what we used to spur conversation at this workshop. So this is a visualization of kind of the life of one research project. So it starts out on the left with a proposal. You're sending a proposal to a donor or granting agency. If you are collecting human subjects data, you're also trying to get your protocol approved by your IRB. Hopefully you're registering your study in a registry. And then once, the order of those things might differ, but in general, those happen ideally before you start collecting or analyzing data. And then after that is the last kind of 4 squares / that oval at the end are the dissemination of research. So there's a lot of arrows happening around peer review, archiving. You might hear, you might get comments from a referee, and you might go back and change your analysis or add something. But there's kind of like a feedback loop here. And then hopefully eventually, if you want to be able to share your results publicly, that would hopefully, I think the ideal for most people is in a journal. But it could also end up in an archive, like a preprint service, as Alex talked about yesterday. And then depending on the kind of work, you would hope that it would be either reproduced, replicated, or reused and cited in order to advance kind of the scientific frontier. The risk of this not happening is what is happening in the top right hand of the panel, where stuff is not either published or it's not archived or it doesn't end up in a registry and it's just kind of lost. Maybe it is retained with the research team or the investigator, or perhaps the people who saw it beforehand, so the granting agency or the IRB, but it's not accessible to the public in the way that we would like.
Katie, before you continue, we just got a quick question from the participants. Jordan is asking, do you know of any work that compares the proportion of significant findings obtained from observational studies with pre-analysis plans versus without? I suspect that a higher proportion of no findings among studies that register their PAPs could be useful to make an argument in favor of PAPs and research credibility.
Yeah, so I don't know about observational, but I can think of at least one paper that we tend to point to for experimental work. We can add a link to that on the OSF or maybe in the chat if we can find it while I'm talking. But it's biomedical research again. There's a lot more research being done on this in the biomedical sciences. But it did show that once clinicaltrials.gov became the go-to registry, and once the FDA began regulating registration and reporting, you could see a fairly large leap in the number of, a large decline in the number of positive results that were being published. They went from, I think this person might have only been looking at a very small subset of studies, so maybe perhaps around like one kind of treatment or pharmaceutical. But you could see that before the registry, there were no negative results that were published. And then afterwards, there were a few. So it's not necessarily rigorous causal evidence, because I think the sample was pretty small, but it is telling. And I would imagine, I guess my prior for that would be that if you did that on a larger sample, you would find something similar. We can find that link and post it for those who would like to see more. Okay, so this is what we kind of use at the workshop to spur discussion, and what we came up with was this. I'll show more details on this in a second, but the idea that most people found most compelling was that there were several points in this life cycle where you could kind of intervene or propose a policy or some kind of guidelines for one of these institutions, be it researchers, IRBs, granting agencies, registries, or journals, to impose on their stakeholders in order to improve reporting. So we can come back to this, but I just wanted to give you a visual before I got into the details. Okay, so here are the details. We are proposing that registries provide space for reporting and interpreting results from both experimental and observational research, ideally in a somewhat standardized way. So clinicaltrials.gov does this. The AEA registry has started doing this year, but I think it's only been, they've only started allowing people to do this for a few months, and not many registered trials have actually done it yet. I know they're pushing for people to start reporting there, but I think it's going to take a big effort to get people aware that this is actually happening, and to show people how to actually do it. I'm not aware of any of the registries that are doing this, although I think the OSF registries are talking about it. Importantly, we would want these to be citable, because if you aren't able to publish your findings in a journal or a preprint or somewhere else that assigns a DOI or is citable, it's going to be hard for people to reuse this work. So yeah, I mentioned the progress this year. And then researchers, this is kind of an obvious one, but planning and committing to report completely and fulfill these commitments. IRBs. So IRBs might seem like kind of out of left field here, but we've often, at least for the social sciences, IRBs are often an institution that almost all researchers will have to go through at some point if you're doing experimental work, if you're working with human subjects. So, if you're working with administrative data or other kind of observational data sets, then you might not have to, but it is, we do think this is one important way to encourage complete reporting. So IRBs use the Belmont report. So if you've ever had to submit an IRB approval, you've probably had to read some version of this, and it lays out 3 main values, and one of those is beneficence. So the idea is that you, as a researcher, are committing to do less harm than the benefit that your research would have. So the benefits of your research need to far outweigh the harms they might cause to human subjects, and ideally not cause any harm. I think it's possible to argue that also includes extending those benefits to the public. So if you're doing research that is supposed to be informing public policy or public health decision making, programming, then it's arguably your responsibility to make sure that these results are available to the people who actually use it. And that there's also, the information that's available is as complete as possible, especially if, someone is going to do a systematic review or some other kind of synthesis. It's much better if that is based on a more complete body of literature. So that's what we're arguing for beneficence here for IRBs. Granting agencies probably have the most power here. I mean, they generally do no matter what, but for this specifically, if anyone here has submitted a proposal to the NSF or to the NIH or other public agencies, they generally ask you to confirm or to briefly discuss the results of research that they have funded for you in the past. They don't necessarily ask you to confirm where these results are. So, I mean, there aren't very many places where you might be able to put them if they're not published in a paper. But we are suggesting that granting agencies now require you both to register your work somewhere and then report, and then tell them where you're reporting it if you're going to submit another proposal to them in the future. We're also proposing that they support this kind of human infrastructure. So the man I pointed out earlier, who's Stanford's one compliance officer for clinical trials reporting, Stanford is a private university, so they perhaps have more funds and resources to support someone like that. There are, as far as we know, even at places at UC Berkeley, which are large universities, the people who are doing this work tend to either be junior faculty or postdocs or people who this isn't their main job, and they're volunteering their time to do this. So if we want this to work effectively, it would be much better off if granting agencies are also supporting this kind of quote infrastructure. And then collecting fees for noncompliance, maybe not in a pandemic year, but when it is feasible to collect fees, at least to show that enforcement is a real thing. Otherwise, your policy doesn't have much teeth if you're not going to actually act on it. And then lastly, journal editors and referees. could require or encourage authors to verify that there is complete and public reporting somewhere prior to accepting a manuscript for publication. Or they could, if they're not requiring that, they could at least use it to inform their publication decisions. Okay, and then the last thing that I'll talk about is the kind of broader impacts that we think this would have. So beyond reducing publication bias, we think it could improve the making more informed decisions on the part of granting agencies and others regarding how to prioritize research proposals and keeping investigators accountable and institutions accountable for that matter. Increasing access to scientific outputs. So this one is kind of obvious, but something that you might hear some of the instructors talk about tomorrow, I think it is tomorrow actually, is that when you have access to the complete, set of outputs of a project, you're also allowing other people to learn, to use what you've done and to build on it and learn from what you've done. So in addition to, creating less biased synthesis, as I mentioned earlier, having like more access to this stuff can actually hopefully accelerate scientific production as well. And then improve policymaking, public decision-making. I think this is fairly obvious when you're talking about biomedical research. You would hope that policy analysts, journalists, and other people who are using evidence would be able to also have improved access to a more complete body of literature and to make more informed decisions as well. And then lastly, equity and inclusivity in science. So as it stands, and I think we talked a bit about this yesterday with Ted, but the incentives and rewards in academic advancement tend to focus on journal-based metrics. So publications and citations, who gets credit for doing what. And the rare system doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily go from 0 to, full equity and inclusivity, but I think it at least starts a conversation around what are alternatives to these metrics. How can we talk about incentives and rewards in a different way? So that is my last slide. I can keep this up if it helps people, if people want to keep talking. But if anyone has any questions, let me know. That's rare.
Thanks for a great presentation, Katie.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be monitoring the chat, and if anyone also wants to just unmute themselves and ask questions, feel free to do so.
I guess I have a question. So you're talking about roles that journals, IRBs, other places would play, and I saw that Andrew Foster's there, so I assume you're having some buy-in from editors. Have you any thoughts? If you talk to people at the IRB, those people are overworked already. I'm not sure they want to take over more work. Or have you gotten feedback from granting agencies?
Yeah, well, so less so from granting agencies, but from IRB representatives, from journal representatives. One thing that it seems like would be helpful is if there were templates that were created. So for IRB, if you, instead of just telling them that they need to do this, giving them proposing language for them to actually include in their policies or questions or that kind of thing, that they could, if they needed to adapt or build off of, they could, but giving them something to start with rather than just imposing a new policy. But yes, IRBs in particular, I think, are the ones that are maybe the least resourced of all of the actors that we mentioned. Granting agencies, and this is kind of maybe an aside. So this workshop that I mentioned it was funded by the NSF, and it's hard to know how much to share. So maybe this is, we can stop the recording here, but basically the kind of motivation for the work, could it advocate for using a top factor for journals? Sure, yeah, I think that's a great idea. I actually hadn't thought about that. But, you could think of it as fitting into one of the tiers. So if people aren't aware, the top guidelines, this is transparency and openness promotion guidelines, that are on the Center for Open Sciences website. They are organized into three tiers, I believe, going from least stringent to most stringent. So you could see complete reporting, identifying where your results are deposited, being like an encouragement in tier 2 or a requirement in tier 3, definitely. Thank you. Thanks for putting the link in the chat. I guess I'll also say that, so like I said, we've submitted this to a journal and we're waiting to hear back. Once this is shared more publicly, we're hoping to launch some kind of, more coordinated, larger effort for this implementation phase. So if anyone is interested, you'll be able to find more information about this and potentially get involved if you want to. Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, you can always email them to me or put them in the Slack or come visit an office hour.